Today, he is going to talk about language policy, anti-racism, and change, where he will be sharing his findings from the Heritage Languages program in Ontario and extend these findings to ask larger questions about the field of language policy. Warmest welcome to Dr. Bale.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here today. Thank you, Angelica, for the invitation, and thanks for the hospitality. U of T is not a poor university, but it's not like this. So very fancy food and fancy quarters. So thank you for all of that. This paper, I also write up my talks to help control how fast I speak. So I might be a little boring to be read to, but the benefit is you can understand what I'm saying, hopefully. But this paper is about language policy activism and making change. It starts from a clear premise you see in yellow here, drawing on the work of Haque, and Donna Patrick, and others, namely about the stability of racialized hierarchies of languages and the people who speak them. But if that's the case, then, wait for it, there we go, then under what conditions is it possible to work across difference and to combat racial and linguistic stratification? Okay, so right. To help me think about the question I just asked about how to work and think across difference, and to frame this paper, I want to draw on Liu Shange's notion of thick solidarity. They begin to theorize this kind of solidarity as the kind that, quote, mobilizes empathy in ways that do not gloss over difference. They further theorize, quote, that thick solidarity layers interpersonal empathy with historical analysis, political acumen, and the willingness to be led by those most directly impacted. Liu Shange wrote this essay for particular subject positions, namely as East Asian American and African American scholars, respectively, each committed to anti-racist change and working to identify a theory of change that can unify multiple racialized communities without erasing the differences in how each group is racialized. I should clarify that Liu Shange were not theorizing about how white people, like me in my case, can or should work in solidarity with racialized people. This complicates my use of their work in this paper. But as I hope to demonstrate in this talk, their thinking is useful for making sense of histories of language policy activism in Canada. So in this presentation today, I'm going to tell two stories of language policy activism and then use this notion of thick solidarity to make some sense of them. So the work I'll share today is part of a larger project that examines the Heritage Languages Program in Ontario, or HLP, as I'll call it, and the many racialized conflicts over it between 1977, when the policy first began, and 1987. Our study is designed as a genealogy of language policy. As such, we begin with our concerns over the present, namely the enduring stability of racialized hierarchies of languages, and again, the people who speak them, and the ongoing marginalization of multilingual people in an officially bilingual Canada. We put these concerns in conversation with the past by examining conflicts over policies that were ostensibly designed to support multilingualism. Our study asked these various research questions, namely what the discursive and material conditions were in 1970s Ontario that produced heritage languages as something recognizable, intelligible to the population, and this particular policy as a putative solution. How those same conditions define which people and which groups can be included as legitimate policy actors and which are excluded. This particular paper focuses on the last two questions, namely the temporary alliances that formed around the HLP and why, and how this particular policy was interpreted by speakers of Indigenous, official, and minority. In Canada, minority refers to Francophones in Anglophone Canada and Anglophones in Quebec. That's what that word means in Canada particularly. So how the members of these various groups, including sign languages, and speakers of varieties of English understood this particular policy. So a few words about the policy itself. The Ontario government announced their plans to create the HLP in the run-up to provincial elections in spring of 1977. By June 15th, so really, really quickly, the policy was already announced. At best, this was a limited intervention. Because of time, I'm not going to go into all of the stipulations you see here on the left, but the two major sticking points are in red. First, heritage language programs were not part of the formal provincial curriculum, and they still aren't. And second, debates would later focus on the program models the policy allowed, either after school, on weekends, or for 30 minutes during the school day if the school timetable were extended. I'll refer to this last model as daytime classes. In many ways, this was a policy that pleased no one. For opponents, it was seen as a waste of public monies and a potential threat to newly minted official bilingualism. For advocates, it still kept heritage language and culture at the margins of school life. But where does this policy fit into the broader historical context? It's important to understand, but it's very hard to convey quickly in a talk like this, the scale of experimentation that was underway in Toronto schools in the late 60s and early 70s. For anyone in the room or online who's familiar with the history of US public education in the 60s and 70s, some of the stories I'll tell might feel familiar to you. So might help make sense of the history in Canada and Toronto. But there already were heritage language programs in Ontario at this time, but they were all privately organized, places of worship, community centers, and whatnot. The Toronto School Board had begun experimenting with transitional bilingual programs in Cantonese, Greek, and Italian in the early 70s. Black parents and activists began setting up Black cultural heritage programs in the early 70s as one way to combat pervasive anti-Black racism in Toronto schools. And even the more traditional New Canadian programs, as they were called, and the ESL programs were being thoroughly reimagined. Much of this work was led by community groups and activists, and of course, it intersected with the international moment of radical change in which everything seemed possible. The ministry intervened in this moment of possibility with the HLP, which, like I said earlier, was at best a political compromise. Consequently, the policy quickly became a site of conflict, often centering on these three questions: whose languages and cultures can be included in school, to what ends, and who gets to decide? This local conflict was also happening within the first few years of official bilingualism in Canada in English and French. I'll say more about this later, but for now it's important to know that official bilingualism only sharpened the questions about why some languages, so in our case in Ontario, why French could be included in the regular provincial curriculum, but others could not. And again, who gets to decide that? In Toronto schools, this experimentation drove over a decade of formal public deliberation about the relationship between language, language, race, and culture. The school authorities initiated their first student census survey in 1970 to understand the racial and linguistic identities of its students. And they organized 3 separate task forces on these topics. You can see here the various foci of each task force: multiculturalism, race relations, and third languages, where, of course, by extension, English and French are the first 2. And the various years these task forces were held. Recall again that the province intervened in 1977 with the Heritage Languages Program. So the 2 stories I'm going to get into more detail about now relate to the last of these task forces, the work group on third language instruction. The original mandate for this task force was to create a comprehensive language policy for the Toronto School Board based on an additive approach to bilingual or even trilingual education models. But the HLP, as a provincial policy, put constraints on the school system in terms of program models. Again, after school, on weekends, or these daytime classes. For most heritage language advocates, these options were insufficient. So the debate that dominated in this work group for third language instruction was how best to integrate heritage language programs into the formal school curriculum and into the regular school day. As we'll see in a moment, advocacy by Black parents and community activists ensured that Black cultural heritage programs were also part of this debate. So the work group first published a discussion paper called The Challenges of Languages. It then engaged in a consultation process to seek feedback on the paper. It organized public meetings where individuals or representatives of organizations could make formal comments, they're called deputations, and also submit written briefs with their stance on the ideas and recommendations in the discussion paper. Based on that feedback, the work group wrote a draft report with recommendations, and the consultation process was repeated. This led to the final report published in March of 1982. Often hundreds of people rather, would show up to these public meetings. The media describes some of these meetings with headlines like this: language battle ready to explode, voices raised in anger against foreign tongues. Not every meeting was like this, but many of them were. Harish Shah, a parent of three, told the Toronto Star about hecklers who threatened him after one meeting. He said, quote, "They told me next time they'll bring white sheets," an obvious reference to the Ku Klux Klan. After another meeting, school trustees described receiving death threats for their support for daytime classes. So the two stories I'll tell today relates to building solidarity among speakers of racialized and minority languages during the work group process and in this overall climate I just described. So the first story relates to a work group meeting on June 24th, 1981, which is pictured here. This was a meeting in response to that first discussion paper, The Challenge of Languages. Seated at the table in the background, I guess, here we go, yeah, these folks here are members of the work group themselves. Here are their names from the final report in 1982. About a third of these work group members were also part of the Heritage Languages Advisory Committee. This is a liaison committee in the school system between heritage language committees and the school system, the school board itself. I'll name Alberta Di Giovanni and Antonio Vas now, as their names will come up later. In fact, I think, yeah, I'll show you where Antonio, or Alberto rather, is seated. This is him right here. This is Alberto Di Giovanni. We just interviewed him before the winter holidays. So to see him from whatever that is, I can't do math. That's 40 years ago, a long time ago. And to see him as a real human now is great to talk with him. Dr. Rita Wright, one of the few Black administrators in the school system, was also a member of the work group representing the board. You can see her here. That's Dr. Wright. Also on the work group was Imogen Walker from the Teachers Union for elementary schools. Even though the union endorsed the final report of this work group in 1982, just 1 year later, they would change their position and organized a protest of heritage language programs through a boycott. I'll come back and tell more about that story later today. But back to the picture now. So seated over here on the right are members of the joint, it's in yellow here, the Joint Ad Hoc Committee of Concerned Communities for Third Language Culture Programs, the big long mouthful of a name. At this meeting, members of this ad hoc committee made formal presentations to the work group. And here you see Karen Brathwaite, a really, really important Canadian activist who just passed away in June, in fact. She was there representing the Organization of Parents of Black Children. Okay, so this first story relates to this meeting. At the meeting, Brathwaite made an opening statement. It touched on the issues her organization had been advocating around for some time, namely racism in the curriculum, a lack of Black teachers and administrators, the streaming of Black youth into vocational and special education programs. Regarding Black cultural heritage programs, she noted they remain woefully inadequate, underfunded when compared to heritage language programs. And like heritage language programs, they remain outside the formal school curriculum. After the presentation, Alberto Di Giovanni didn't ask Brathwaite about any of the ideas she presented. Instead, he asked her about magnet schools organized around individual heritage languages. Members of the Armenian and Ukrainian communities had proposed magnet schools as a solution to the scheduling problem for the HLP, and this became a major topic of discussion for this particular work group. In response to Di Giovanni's question, Brathwaite argued against magnet schools. As she explained her opinion, she referred at times to the history of segregation in the United States. Di Giovanni kept asking this question. He asked a total of 4 times. Each time Brathwaite and other Black parents at the meeting argued against magnet schools. The minutes of the meeting paraphrased Brathwaite at her most emphatic, stating, quote, "That the Black community have had a long experience with segregated schools. Children must be kept in regular school classes for their future benefit." Dr. Wright also intervened regarding magnet schools in this conversation. My interpretation of the minutes is that she was defending the idea of magnet schools, but Black parents at the meeting remained unconvinced. The next entry in the minutes read, quote, the point was made that generally the Black parents, you can get a sense of who's taking the minutes, right? The Black parents want their children to be part of the regular school system, end quote. Near the end of the meeting, and after several back and forth over this question, Antonio Vaz is paraphrased as, quote, reaffirming the general feeling that Blacks have been segregated for too long and the need now is to come together. This would seem to negate the initiation of magnet or alternate schools. In other words, as it seems to me, at least, as the meeting came to an end, the work group representatives like Di Giovanni, like Antonio Las, like Dr. Wright, might finally have really heard what Braithwaite and her colleagues had argued. The discussion of magnet schools was the main topic covered in the meeting minutes, even though it had nothing to do with Braithwaite's opening statement. The other major topic in these minutes relates to a question that Braithwaite asked of the group. She requested clarification about the task force's mandate, whether it aimed to focus only on language or also on language and culture. This led to another exchange about the relationship between language, race, and culture. But recall, this was the third of 3 task forces over almost a decade, but it remained a central area of debate, conversation, and unclarity. Work group members stated they agreed in principle with Braithwaite and colleagues about not artificially dividing language and culture, yet the following extracts from the minutes suggest that Black parents at the meeting didn't really believe them. One parent argued, culture and language have not been brought together. There is more emphasis on the language issue, end quote. For this parent, it explains why, in part, why funding for Black cultural heritage programs is only token, as she described it. Another parent argued, quote, racism is still prevalent. Black language has been stripped from the Black community historically, end quote. I interpret the second excerpt as based on a stance that the experience of language, culture, and racism are inseparable for the Black community. As such, policies and curriculum in response shouldn't separate them either. So for me, this first story is all about the very different political positions that heritage language advocates and Black parents held, and the difficulty that heritage language advocates had or seemed to have in really hearing and understanding where Black parents were coming from. For the second story, it relates to the outcome of this particular work group. Excuse me. Like I said earlier, in 1982, the work group published its final report, which the board accepted wholesale. Despite all the debates during the task force itself about bilingual programs, magnet schools, and so on, the main recommendations of this final report focused on getting as many elementary schools as possible to implement these daytime heritage language classes. That is, extending the school day by 30 minutes and slotting in a half an hour of heritage language instruction. In 1983, the school board, I guess the district, here's called the district, the school district, followed through with its recommendation and issued new rules to govern this process of changing an elementary school to a daytime heritage language school. If 25 or more parents at a given school requested these daytime classes, then the school was required to hold a public meeting, like the one you see pictured here. Then parents would have a straight vote up or down for or against starting daytime classes at their school. A simple majority, that is 50% plus 1, would be enough to trigger heritage language classes. I said the word trigger, it's actually a thing in the US, trigger laws for charter schools, right? It's the same idea, but from maybe a more progressive perspective. I'm not sure if New York has trigger laws for charter schools, but it's a thing in the US. Sorry for the diversion. But these same rules, though, that I'm mentioning now, they prohibited teachers from intervening in the discussion, whether they were for or against heritage programs. Didn't matter, teachers could not speak at these meetings. So from the perspective of many teachers, these rules gave parents the final say in how a local school was organized. This was a dramatic break with how schools had been organized in the past, which is really a question of administrators and teachers making the decisions, but now parents are being given a say. As such, in April of '83, the teachers union, the teachers union filed a grievance to have the policy guidelines blocked. It would take almost 3 years to resolve that grievance. By January of '84, the grievance was still not resolved, and teachers initiated a work-to-rule boycott to protest daytime heritage language classrooms, and this boycott would last until May of that year. Heritage language advocates from multiple communities came together to denounce the teachers' boycott as based on racism. As this article details, there it is, it reads, quote, at a news conference yesterday, parents representing 8 cultural communities, Black, Chinese, Greek, Italian, Portuguese, Asian, Spanish, and French, called the 2-week-old boycott of after-school programs racial discrimination by teachers aimed at stopping heritage language programs. Eduardo Sousa, a Portuguese parent, said it very clearly, quote, we believe the real reason behind the arguments used by the teachers is racism. So let's go back to the timeline I showed. In February of '84, shortly after the press conference I just described, the board offered a compromise of sorts to raise the threshold of the parent vote required to trigger daytime classes from a simple majority to an enhanced majority, although they never clarified what that would mean. 60%, 70%, whatever. They never clarified what that would mean. Either way, the union refused the offer. For heritage language parents and advocates, this was the final straw. The very next day, all 23 parents on the Heritage Language Advisory Committee, they quit. They are protesting both the board's sellout of heritage languages by making it harder for parents to have a say, but also the teachers' boycott, which they viewed as motivated by racism. As one school leader noted, quote, parents clearly walked out in frustration, feeling their role had been subverted. Okay, so how can we make sense of these two stories in relation to thick solidarity in language policy activism? To address this question, I want to situate these stories in a broader historical context. So I'm going to return to the notion of multiculturalism within the bilingual framework, which is based on the Official Languages Act of 1969 and the multiculturalism policy of 1971. As Eve Haque has argued so beautifully, official bilingualism aimed to resolve a fundamental tension in Canada by placing Anglophones and Francophones on a more equal terms through the question of language rights. At the same time, this process denied official language status to Indigenous peoples and to other immigrant communities. The government tried to resolve this tension by proposing the slogan of multiculturalism within a bilingual framework. That is, allowing immigrants to sustain their culture while denying them formal language rights. As Haque shows us, this framework reproduced a long-standing racial hierarchy in Canada. What changed, though, was the discourse used to encode this hierarchy. Instead of naming specific communities in racial terms, this framework named them, and names them still to this day, in linguistic terms. The outcome was and still is the same. Policies such as the HLP challenged this racialized logic of official bilingualism. These policies allowed heritage language communities to make new demands for linguistic inclusion where official bilingualism had previously excluded them. But because language was the discursive terrain on which racial hierarchies were organized in Canada, and they still are, the parent demands were met with an explicitly racist backlash. As you saw with the second story, through press conferences and protest resignations, heritage language communities were able to act together, to come together quickly and act decisively in response to this racist backlash. In other words, in the face of such attacks, it seemed easy to link arms, to come together, and to act in unison. This would seem to be a positive story about building thick solidarity, but it doesn't really tell us the full story. Let's go back to the historical context. As Haque also argues, multiculturalism within the bilingual framework in Canada is based on an assumption that language and culture can be conceptually and then politically separated. In this way, Indigenous and other immigrant cultures can be acknowledged. Their cultures can be supported within a framework of official bilingualism, in English and French only, but their languages cannot. Our study further reveals how the separation led to demands in the 70s for more attention and policy to language programs in particular. That is, because multiculturalism within the bilingual framework explicitly excluded Indigenous languages and immigrant languages, it set a political trajectory into motion in which Indigenous peoples and other immigrant communities made specific demands for greater access to their languages, in particular at school. In some ways, the demands for heritage language programs reproduce this conceptual and then political separation between language and culture. In Toronto, we see this with the progression of foci in the three task forces I showed earlier from the 70s and 80s. It begins with this more nebulous notion of multiculturalism. It then talks about race relations, and finally gets to the question of language programs in particular. The meeting in June of '81 that I described in the first story, I think reflects this dynamic of separating language from culture. On the one hand, a broad coalition of heritage language advocates seemed very keen on magnet schools, an idea premised on one language per school. And when questioned about the relationship between language and culture within the context of heritage language programs, they emphasized their interest in language programs. On the other hand, some Black parents and activists, based on their experiences of racism, insisted on the inseparability of language and culture. From this political analysis, they demanded the structural inclusion of programs based on anti-racism, language, and culture, and reorganizing schools around them. So this meeting I shared earlier, to me, indicates the incommensurability of these two positions. As we saw, heritage language advocates at that meeting, they really struggled to hear what it was Black parents and community activists were arguing what they really meant. Their focus on, their meaning heritage language advocates, their focus on language made it difficult for them to really make sense of the demands for an inclusive political approach to anti-racism, language, and culture. So the stories I've shared today suggest that a thin solidarity may have been easier to achieve. That is, in the face of racist backlash, members of multiple racialized and minoritized communities were able to come together, to have press conferences, to resign in unison, and so on, and work together in perhaps a more defensive posture. But when it came to discussing and collaborating about the positive change these communities wanted to see, here things got a bit more complicated. To return to some of the key dimensions of thick solidarity that Liu and Shange theorized that I showed earlier in the talk, it seems that many heritage language advocates struggled, empathized with Black parents and community activists. To attend to differences between anti-Black racism and other forms of oppression, to be more strategic politically in how they built coalitions, and to take their lead from Black parents who experienced racism in terms of language and culture in very specific ways. It seems that this kind of thick solidarity was not very present in advocacy for more robust programs for third language and culture in Toronto schools in the 1980s. Much of our study about the conflicts over heritage language programs in Toronto in the 70s and the 80s have led us to identify important lessons in the negative. It's kind of a bummer talk, sorry. That is lessons taken from failed activism and failed advocacy. In this case, there are important lessons to draw from the absence of thick solidarity and debates among advocates for heritage language and culture programs that were more linguistically and racially just. Given the ongoing marginalization of speakers of racialized and minoritized languages, these historical lessons of absence are still powerful for helping us think and act differently rather in future language policy activism. This is the main lesson emerging from our particular study that I wanted to share today. I've given a version of this talk a couple times now in the last, 4 or 5 months, and this is the slide I've ended on. But as it happens, life is more interesting than that. And once again, it seems the future is now. This is an ad taken out by the successor union to the union I just talked about, protesting cuts in heritage language programs. It comes from what is now the Toronto District School Board, which is the largest school district in Canada, 250,000 students. And once again, the school district is facing really important budget cuts. And as almost always the case, heritage language and Black cultural heritage programs are first on the chopping block. Nowadays, they're called international languages and African heritage programs, but they're just as marginalized and just as vulnerable as before. They continue to be held mostly after school and on weekends. They continue to be taught by instructors, not by certified teachers, and they continue to not be part of the provincial curriculum, which leaves them really at the margins of school life. So this picture from the paper just on Saturday, in fact, was paid for by the elementary teachers of Toronto, the union, for grades K to 8. It's great that the union is defending these programs and not boycotting them like they did in the 80s. That's progress. That's a good thing. But on what terms though? I know it's hard to see from the audience, but these are the two bullet points here: African heritage programs, international language programs. I'll show it on Zoom for folks on Zoom. I'm referring to these parts right here. Um, but the way they describe, the way this ad protesting budget cuts, the way it describes African heritage programs feels a long way from the specific intervention against anti-Black racism as parents first conceptualized them in the 70s and 80s, and as Brathwaite described them in that meeting from June of 81. For international languages, the language offered here is not particularly clear what the benefits are. Is it good for learning a new language? Is it good for talking to your elders and your family? A very private reason to learn language. It's not quite clear what the benefits are. But to me, most troubling is framed as an unfunded mandate. Schools are required to offer the programs if parents want it, but now the province is cutting that funding. So as I was sitting in my armchair as the 1,000-year-old person I am, reading the paper in print at home, this is a picture from the actual paper from in my living room on Saturday. I was thinking of this talk, in fact, and asking myself, how do we combine the interpersonal empathy with historical analysis, political acumen, and the willingness to be led by those most directly impacted in ways that don't gloss over difference to challenge, once again, pending budget cuts of heritage language programs in Toronto? That may be a place to start for the discussion, but thanks for being here today and thanks for your attention. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Jeff. So are you telling us that you do not have the answer to that question?
No, you're far too ambitious to claim to have answers. It's not my job. I'm just a professor.
Come on.
I don't give answers.
Do we have questions in the audience here and or on Zoom? There must be lots of little things, lots of little bulbs that went off in people's heads. Don't be shy. I think people are processing
It's a lot.
all the things
a
that
lot.
you just, yes,
And you have to
presented.
here's Canada in 15 minutes. Here's the story. It's a lot to take in.
Yeah.
And so this is a common problem of how to share this research, even in Canada. Nobody has a clue about heritage language programs. So it's a lot. Yeah. So I'm sorry. I apologize for the.
Oh, don't. No. We're not here to apologize. We're here to learn.
All right.
So Andrew is about to raise his head. Okay.
Hello. Thanks so much for a really wonderful talk. And growing up in Toronto, it put a lot of my experiences in context, definitely. But you mentioned that some of these discourses were commented on by, say, deaf communities and sign language using communities. And so I can't imagine there was a thick solidarity between them and these programs either. So I was wondering, what were some of the debates that emerged when incorporating, say, ASL or I guess Quebecois Sign Language classes into the discussion?
It's a great question. In that time, there actually weren't. So the presence of sign languages in Ontario doesn't come in formal policy does not come along for many, many more years. This is I'm going to say I have a hypothesis I have. I'm not sure it's true though. But it seems like this fight over heritage languages and Black cultural heritage programs was the beginning of thinking differently about language and culture in schools more broadly. So this is the first big fight in the 70s and 80s. I'm trying to think when you were in school. I'm trying to base on how old Pia is when you were in school. But it wasn't until 1998 that Francophones in Ontario had the right to organize their own schools, like separate school systems. And the right to use ASL and LSQ in schools was not codified as law until 1994 or 7. Either Bill 4 97 or Bill 7 or 94. I got those backwards. My point though is that this particular fight, from my perspective, set a bunch of subsequent fights into motion, and people used the HLP as an example, saying, well, they can do that, why can't we, right? So that's sort of the big picture. The irony of your question is that since the current Minister of Education, Lecce, did authorize using ASL, probably LSQ as well, but I'm not sure, in the French boards, as an international language. So in high school, you can learn ASL as an international language. And the incredible irony is that it is now easier for hearing people to learn ASL in public schools than it is for deaf and hard of hearing people to use their natural language as their first language. And that's actually one of my doctoral students, Phyllis Beaton Vasquez, this is her dissertation, is a very similar research methodology applied to that Bill 407 in 94, 97, to understand what the discourse is around introducing the right to use, both to recognize ASL as a language, LSQ as a language per se, which is always a debate among education policy folks. Like, are the, well, we'll get to that, but as a language, and then to authorize them for use as medium of instruction in the 4 deaf schools in the province. So there's 3 for English and ASL and 1 for French and LSQ. So the irony is that 30 years later, having this bill that recognizes sign languages as languages and the right to use them as a medium of instruction in the deaf schools, it is now 30 years on, generation later, harder for deaf and hard of hearing kids to access sign language than it is for hearing people. And the HLP program is part of that contradiction. But back in the 70s and 80s, there was actually very little conversation at all. Yeah.
Actually, now I have a different question.
Great,
based
go
on
for it.
this. Do deaf students go to non-deaf schools also? And
Yes, so it's a double whammy or a multiple whammy, maybe, of the enrollments at the 4 provincial deaf schools have gone down consistently for the last 30 or 40 years, maybe 30 years. And it's for all kinds of reasons. And enrollments in, there's no good way to say it, mainstream schools or whatever, inclusion-based schools goes up. But the right to have access to sign language is not, first, isn't there. They can't use sign language as a medium of instruction. You have right to an interpreter, to hearing devices, or having like a microphone that goes right to your hearing aid. Pardon me, for hard of hearing kids. But it's, yeah, kids are pretty much on their own. It's a pretty bleak situation. I would describe it as that. I know I'm being recorded, so I should watch out this, but I say it's a pretty bleak situation. Part of it is also, like most parts of at least North America and Europe, probably all over the world, moments after a child's born, they're giving a hearing test, right? And the program that regulates that is called the Infant Hearing Program in Ontario. It does formally offer parents for kids who fail that test and are determined to be hard of hearing or deaf. It formally offers parents the right to choose a hearing route for their child, an oral hearing route for their child, or a sign language route. It does not offer both, which is the reality for many, many people in their life, is to have both. That is not an offer. But another one of our doctoral students, Tracy Edelsky, wrote a beautiful, beautiful dissertation on the IHP program and interviewing parents and how whatever they wanted, because this is perceived, this experience as a traumatic event often, to give birth to a deaf or hard of hearing kid, which has its own critique to go through what that means. But in that moment, when you're being told pick a route and you can't go back, you can't switch, when in fact the oral route is the one that's implicitly favored. So you have then the whole medical infrastructure placing emphasis on implantation, on medical devices, on oral, which makes it, it's creating a decline in sign language use. Probably the best way to say it. It's producing a decline in that use. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what about Indigenous peoples' languages? Are they taught in school at all, or are they part of the after school or home language, or
both and? So this is complicated. In the past, when I've shown the tables of which languages were supported in the 70s, it includes Cree, includes, again, these are the English words for these languages: Cree, Mohawk, Ojibwe. One more I'm going to forget. I should know it. But I have, the first question is often from our Indigenous colleagues saying, we don't want our languages associated with heritage. So I've stopped showing that slide because it triggers a lot of emotion around the relationship between migrant languages and Indigenous languages. So I don't share that slide anymore. But as a matter of historical fact, this particular program is used from the very, very beginning to support the teaching of Indigenous languages. Since then, there was again, sort of that like domino effect. The first big fight after this was the Native Education Program. It's called that in the 80s. And that's where there was an attempt to integrate more Indigenous languages into publicly funded schools, very similar to the US. There are federally run, the federal government in Canada is responsible for on-reserve schooling, but the majority of Indigenous kids go to school in public schools. So there's like the same contradiction as the US. And so in publicly funded schools, meaning provincially funded schools, the move was for the first time in the 80s to offer Indigenous languages. And now there are separate streams. There's a way to learn Indigenous languages sort of on the modern language framework, 20 minutes a day, 30 minutes a day, and then in high school, like that 5-day-a-week model that exists. And then also the particular policy, the international languages policy, was rebranded recently, international and Indigenous languages. So it's a huge mess of policymaking because the government can't figure out what it wants to do. But there are programs. They are taught by extremely dedicated and talented, not just elders. There are other speakers besides elders who speak Indigenous languages, and they were again working with limited curriculum resources and all the constraints that many less commonly taught languages face. Yeah.
Interesting. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Sure. Yeah. Oh yeah. Sorry for the Zoomers.
Thank you, Jeff, for the talk. Maybe this is something that I missed that you mentioned, but is this conversation only taking place in public schools? And if so, are private schools offering any HLP or anything different?
So private schools have a much smaller profile in Canada than the US. They exist and they are largely for, I think this is fair to say, they're largely for, they're very elite spaces. So there's not also in Ontario, it's one of the few provinces that funds Catholic schools publicly. So we have actually 4 different school systems in Ontario. We have English public, English Catholic, French public, and French Catholic. It's all publicly funded, right? So some of the differentiation that the US uses private schools to achieve, Ontario already has funded by the state, by the government, right? So private schools play a very small role in Ontario in the profile of schooling. So I don't actually know if they teach heritage languages. If they did, it would not receive public funding. They wouldn't receive it. Many private schools will use provincial curriculum so their kids can access, their graduates can access university the same way, but they don't receive any public funding. But yes, the Catholic system has in some ways more robust programming than the public systems do. And in fact, the Catholic system in Toronto has many more of the daytime classes where you have 30 minutes more of school and you put a language in. The Catholic schools historically were more homogenous in terms of which non-English language is present. So Italian speakers, primarily Portuguese speakers, were in the same schools, whereas the public schools were always more multilingual, always from the very beginning. So it's sort of an historical happenstance that because public schools were always more linguistically diverse, it made it more complicated to think about which language do you pick for your extra 30 minutes if you have 10 languages in the school, right? Yeah. Sure. Amy?
Yeah, the same. Thank you for the talk. And something that I was thinking that I'm not sure whether or not you've been looking at it is the teacher training, because you were talking about the cutting the funds, right? And well, something that I've seen also is that already at the teacher training level, putting together methodology courses that are for ESL teachers, that are for second language learners teachers, that future heritage language teachers, and they are all put together in the same classroom. And I said, well, if you're already there, we are suddenly, because of the funds that have been cut at universities, if already at the teacher training level, we're putting together everybody, in the same classroom. How are they even going to advocate later for anything, for responding to the needs that the students and the classrooms are going to bring? So I don't know if you had any insight on that.
Sure. I mean, yeah, it's a really important question. Right now, there are no teacher training opportunities for I'll use the current term, international languages. They don't exist. And it has to do with at the elementary level, international languages are not part of the curriculum. So there's no pathway to be certified to teach the language because there's no curriculum to teach, right? It's sort of it's a paradox or a catch-22. At the secondary level, since the 80s, since 1987, you can take a heritage language or an international language for a credit. Those teachers do have to be certified, right? But it's this sort of vicious circle where there was a big change to teacher education policy in 2015 in Ontario. And since then, all of the pathways to become a certified teacher for international language at the secondary level, they don't exist. So as those people retire or they change their language profile, maybe in most cases, they would teach, say, Spanish as a main language, and then maybe they taught some Portuguese over here, right? But now the Portuguese program's gone, so now they just teach Spanish. So there are no more classes offered at the secondary level, or very few, and there's no pathway to become a certified teacher in that particular area. And part of it is also the fight. This goes back to the union question. Originally, the union demanded that teachers be fully certified, so they're on par with a grade 1 classroom teacher or a math teacher, whatever it is. The province said no, but then when the union decided to fight heritage language programs, they stopped demanding that teachers be certified. So you have effectively a two-tier system where you have the real teachers in the classroom, and then these guest teachers come in for 20 minutes or 30 minutes and teach their language and leave again. So there's a really beautiful study a now retired colleague of mine, Grace Feuerweger, did in 1997, published in 97, interviewing HL teachers and describing like what it's like to feel like you're always sort of a what's the word she used? Not an invader, but you get what I'm trying to say. Like feeling like you're not welcome in the space you're teaching, and fighting over, you used my eraser, you stole my chalk. This is back in the 90s. There were no whiteboards yet, but you stole my chalk. The sort of stupid fights, right? Territorial fights. And that sort of second-class status is still very, very real for heritage language teachers, for international language teachers. Yeah. Please, yeah. Are there questions online too? I see two. Okay, great.
Just wondering about the students' experience. Is there research done for those students who went through the heritage learning training and what their opinion about, like, what was the result? What is that, a positive or negative?
Yeah, it's a great question. Right now, the answer is no. I was saying to Angelica in the podcast we did earlier, so my formal applied linguistic training is in language policy, and Canada is like a poster case for this, right? Bilingualism, all this stuff, right? And even heritage language stuff. There's stuff that Patsy Duff wrote, Jim Cummins wrote in the 80s and 90s. Really, it's really good stuff, really important stuff. This research fell off a cliff in the mid 90s. Part of it's because all the government funding for heritage language programs, both at the federal and provincial levels, just dried up, just stopped. I don't want to speak ill of my colleagues, that's my intent, but people just shifted their research, right? So people started asking questions about multilingualism inside of ESL programs or inside French second language programs, which is itself important. I don't want to say it's unimportant. But that research just for like a generation stopped. So when I moved to Toronto in 2014, I was so keen to do this work. I looked around, I was like, wow, there's no one doing this work. So it's just now, I'd say in the last 5 years, there's another generation of early career scholars just finishing their PhDs, doing really, really, really exciting work on inside heritage language contexts. I don't know of any that's around student experience. I haven't seen that sort of work. I think it's more, well, no, it's about, I talked about this, I guess, at the podcast too. It's about questions of Chinese language variation in Mandarin programs. So Mandarin might be the target language, but the kids sitting there, they're bringing all kinds of Chinese languages with them to the classroom. And to what extent do teachers pay attention to that? Right now, the answer is not much, but how do we help teachers leverage all the plurilingualism in these kids' lives to learn this target language, right? There are some Cantonese programs remaining. They're smaller now, but the same thing, like how do you use multiple languages to get the differences of oral and written Cantonese, like to learn those very complicated things, right? And then the question of plurilingualism or translanguaging, whatever your theoretical approach to that is, people who do heritage language work might know heritage teachers are often the strictest about, nope, this is a target language only space, no English, no whatever. because the language feels so threatened, feels so fragile. And that doesn't really jive with more contemporary theories of language learning, right? So how do you open space for plurilingual practice, for translanguaging practices in heritage classrooms? That's the work happening. There's also really beautiful work happening around Southern perspectives. African as epistemologies brought to spaces where both African and Arabic, African languages and Arabic are from Africa are taught. So really exciting work, but not that sort of stuff. If you ask people, did you go to anything for Italian? No, or for Bengali? No.
They tried to make it happen.
Ah, that's awesome. So Andrew's sister and I were very dear friends. I get to answer that question directly. Sorry. If you ask most people, like my students in my classes at Toronto, many of them were sent to IL programs, and they'll say, yeah, I was like babysitting. Colors, numbers, shapes, every year over and over again. They will describe it being sort of a waste of time. But that's not scientific. That's just them answering my questions. Yeah, of course.
So you were saying that maybe sometimes it was hard to decide which heritage language to teach. Does that mean like if you had kids from 5 different countries in the class, you would learn 5 different languages at different times, or how did they do it?
Not quite like that, but it's more every question. There's just they're great questions, but it's hard to know how to not talk for 1,000 minutes. So there's different levels of it. So one is it's partly what I mentioned magnet schools really briefly in there. Part of it was for Armenian was and still is a smaller language in Toronto. So there's no way there's ever going to be enough Armenian kids in one school to run a heritage program in your neighborhood elementary school. So that poses a problem. What does the school district do? So nowadays, I can really only speak for Greater Toronto, they will set up the larger languages, you're fine because there's enough kids. But for smaller languages, they'll distribute those languages across your district as equally or whatever, as reasonably as possible. So at least you can be driven or take the bus or walk, you can get to a program that's not all the way across town, right? That's one way to solve that problem. In the moment, though, in the 70s and 80s, there's really beautiful research. A dissertation was done on this in the 80s on one school on the border between Little Italy and Chinatown, where actually there was a big Portuguese-speaking community in Little Italy and then Chinatown, and how Chinese and Portuguese at that time was from Portugal. So a large migration to Canada from Portugal proper. Whereas nowadays Brazil is the largest importer or exporter of Portuguese to Canada. But how parents learn to work together and to figure out, well, if these two major communities in our school, you can't put them together. There's no connection to languages. So how do you create space for both communities, both languages in the school? And they were very, very successful for a very short amount of time. And the person who wrote the dissertation, we actually interviewed her for the study. She said it's because of the principal. There was a principal there for 5 years. He just knew how to work across the difference and bring people together. And the minute he left, it all fell apart. So those are the stories we're just starting to get into more because we're talking to people. Most of the research I share with you today is all based on our archival work. We have 13,000 pages of scanned text. It's a lot of data, but both because of the pandemic and because of getting through the archival work, we're just now in the last year starting to talk to people, and we're getting these really juicy stories like that. Yeah.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Somebody else?
Wonderful. Any final questions for our dear colleague here? No? Great. Well, please help me in thanking Jeff for this amazing work that you are doing, for sharing your research with us. Very interesting. I think we have a long ways to go, right? But we're making change happen.
Yeah.
So please help me. Thank Jeff. Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Jeff.